I'd like to start the evening by welcoming you all here to our first Dean's Lecture for 2024, which is always a fantastic opportunity to engage with our good friends and people from the faculty. So thank you very much for being here. A really impressive big crowd, so tremendous. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Jim Waterston, the Dean of the Faculty. Look, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people, and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that we're on unceded land, and our Indigenous friends have been here for 60,000 years and they're our first teachers. And this is why we're here tonight, and I'm really excited about all Dean's lectures, but very much so tonight. So I am truly delighted to welcome one of our own Faculty of Education experts to launch the 2024 Dean's Lecture Series. Professor Therese Hopfenbeck. Where are you, Professor? Therese, great to see you, thank you. We've recruited in the last few years to build our capacity, and we've also grown our own, and it's fantastic to see people who have been with the faculty for a long time move into level E positions, and it's also brilliant to bring in experts from around the world, and Therese is one of those experts, and she's made a massive impact here already in just over a year. So thank you, Therese, for agreeing to deliver your lecture. I really appreciate it. It's a great opportunity for all of us to engage with your work and to think about some of the issues that are really important in terms of assessment that we're going to think about tonight. Okay, I'd now like to share more about Therese's impressive and diverse career. Therese Hopfenbeck is a Professor in Educational Assessment and the Director of the Assessment and Evaluation Research Centre here at the Faculty of Education, arriving in September 2022. She has been directing numerous research projects internationally and has been an expert advisor for several government and non-profit organisations. Professor Hopfenbeck's research focuses on bridging research on self-regulation, classroom-based assessment and making sense of international large-scale studies in education. Not surprisingly, given the lecture topic, she has been an expert advisor on the implementation of formative assessment programs across the world, including India, South Africa, Tanzania, Norway and the Emirates, and carried out policy work for the UNESCO, OECD and the Norwegian Ministry of Education, Norway. Before taking up the position in the Assessment and Evaluation Research Centre here at the faculty, she was the Director of the Oxford University Centre for Education Assessment and continues to be a visiting fellow at Kellogg College. Furthermore, she is an adjunct professor of the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, a member of the visiting panel for the research at the Education Testing Service in Princeton, and chair of the Expert PISA 2025 Questionnaire Framework Group appointed by the OECD and ACER from 2022 to 2026. Professor Hopfenbeck is also the elected President of the Association of Educational Assessment Europe and lead editor of the journal Assessment in Education, Principle, Policy and Practice. Additionally, I'd like to highlight that Professor Hopfenbeck has a passionate interest in artificial intelligence as it relates to the impact on education and assessment. For those of you who are equally fascinated by AI and how teachers can start exploring new technology in their classrooms, I encourage you to listen to our Talking Teaching podcast episode featuring Therese, which tackles the question, is AI in the classroom a friend or foe? You can scan your QR code presented on the screen if you want to listen to that podcast, and it is something that you will certainly enjoy and think more about once you've listened to it. Just before I finish, I do want to say something personally, just having read sort of a bio and CV. I do want to say that what denotes Therese is her incredible passion. She goes at 100 miles an hour and doesn't know how to do that any slower. Her commitment to her work and to the people that she works with is second to none. It's just brilliant and really focused. She's got a tough gig at the moment, and she's really reforming the work and making sure that we can build capacity within the research centre. And she's a genuine leader and an innovator, and I think that work will and is already showing a great promise, and will make sure that the AERC, the research centre, will be around for a very long time in the future under her astute and most capable leadership. So considering all of this, Therese, it's most fitting to have you as an expert to deliver the Dean's Lecture tonight. So please join me in giving Therese a very warm welcome, and I look forward to speaking.
Thank you very much, Jim. I really appreciated those words. I also would like to acknowledge the country, and I'm also very, very honored that we have Professor Melita here. And I also want to thank all in the leadership, the deans, and so honored to have previous directors of ARC and previous deans here. You have been welcoming me and us, I will say. Josh McRae also coming to Australia from Oxford in a way which we really, really appreciate. So it's an honor to be asked to do this. I will also say it's a bit daunting because when I was sitting down and preparing myself for this talk, I looked at what previous people have been doing here. And 10 years ago, you introduced one of my big heroes, Linda Darling Hammond. So I was thinking, okay, the bar is high. And then I went on and I listened to Lindsay, which is also my line manager, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, because that was the rock star of the faculty. So you can see I'm very honored, and this is also just passé. This is a little for you too, because you're up next sometime. But I will just say thank you. Thank you so much. And I would like to also say that I'm just here now 12 months in, and what I will present is very much something that we have been doing the 12 months I've been here. And then I would also like to acknowledge that I'm presenting things which I've done together with others. So there will be a lot of things which we do together with others because we work in teams. And those who are able to work for a long time, they are those who work strongly together and go together, because research is really hard work. So, what about this topic? I'm very fortunate to be in the Faculty of Education in Melbourne. Some people ask me, why would you go to Melbourne after Oxford? And I was thinking, what kind of weird question is that, really? And I said to them, why would you not? And someone was talking about the time zones. And I appreciate that, because sometimes when I would like to have Prosecco, I need a coffee online, when the other's having Prosecco over in Scandinavia. But apart from that, this is actually the center of the world. And I'm just saying that because I started my interest for teaching, assessment, research by reading all the work which was coming out of Australia. And I was wondering, why is that so? I was reading about approaches to learning. I read John Biggs, I read John Hattie, I read Patrick Griffin, I read about all these big thinkers. I listened to Esther Kerr in Berlin. I was thinking, what is going on? And it was just very inspiring. And if you're thinking about this country, it's huge. I mean, it's almost the size of Europe. But it's 26 million people here. So how have you been able to do that? Well, I think it is because you collect the best together. And I just want you to follow us now. Here we are, ARC. If you go and look at us, we just had one researcher, Shelley Gillis, had a German researcher, Stefan, over, working with her several weeks. So here you can read about what we're doing. We have Sundance Sun, who just happened to be part of a team who went to participate in a world competition, and she won. She was leading a team. And then we had Ellen Bertani, who went to Stanford. And I just love this, because she's the youngest. But if you go here and look at all the research we have, you can also see pictures like this. History in the making. Ellen Bertani sitting here at the table talking to Condoleezza Rice. And that's also a good reminder for me that there are some good policymakers in the US. What I'm saying is, there's a lot to be proud of. The first time I met Patrick Griffin, you probably don't remember that, but that was in Abu Dhabi, and we were at a measurement conference, and you were talking about assessing 21st century competencies. You were presenting the work you had been working on for so many years. And I was talking about a research project, which I'm going to share a little bit about, from Oxford, but it was about lessons learned from PISA. I also wanted to show that Esther Kerr, who also worked at the Assessment Research Center, she has been working on these issues, and particularly in the context of Africa. And that is one of the things which is so extremely important for me, which I will come back to, that one of the reasons I'm interested in these studies is because we need to discuss assessment in the context they are used. And that is a challenge with international large-scale studies if we interpret them without thinking about the context. So I will come back to that. But I thought it was great to showcase also the book, which Esther has just been part of. Unfortunately, I'm still working on a translation for some of my main books. There's only one here in English, but I will tell you ideas of what I've been working on for 20 years, which I've published in Norwegian and Danish and Swedish. I also need to flag up one thing right away. If you're working on international large-scale studies, such as PISA, I will acknowledge that I have taken a decision to continue to do that, and it is controversial. It started a long time ago when I took a PhD in Norway because my supervisor, Professor Svein Lie, he had been, of course, to Australia, been working with, among other, Ray Adams, Margaret Wu, Acer, on the first framework for PISA. And he was talking to me about how this new international large-scale study could actually have an impact on how we were thinking about assessment. But he also focused not upon the rankings, but about the ideas, how students approach learning, what they're thinking about their interest in science, their motivation, their self-esteem, their self-concept, their belief about the future, their hope for the future, climate change. So I did a PhD using PISA data in Norway, and then I was also part of a test developer problem-solving team, which brought me to Australia. I was so happy. I remember the day I was flying in, it was black and cold in Norway. I walked out of the plane here in Melbourne. It was blue skies, sunshine, and flowers, strong colors. And I was thinking, this is it. and then I came back, and Mark had been to Sydney a few years earlier, and he was like, if we ever get the chance, this is where we need to go. Closest place to heaven. So, member of QUEG means that I've also been a member of the questionnaire expert group, and I've been doing that since 2015. That basically means that I'm meeting other experts internationally, regularly, and we look at how we can develop questionnaires for the PISA study, which are reliable, valid, which suits the different contexts. And this year, I'm also chairing that committee. So for some of you who know people in ACER, you know I will also say thank you to colleagues in ACER who might listen to this later. And some of them couldn't come because they're also in Sydney. I was dissemination lead for PISA in England and dissemination lead for PEARLS in England, which I will come back to a little bit when I was working together with Josh. But I wanted to say this because obviously some colleagues of mine have said to me, you have chosen the dark side. And I have discussed a lot what it means to actually keep your integrity and work with data from PISA. And I'm constantly keeping an eye on how we can use them in better ways. And that's why I want to be very open about this. Since I need to remind myself, I very often also write about it. And this is what I wrote in 2016, so you can just read it yourself. For me, this is a mission. But I was inspired, and I will probably again and again come back to this journal. So I'm shamelessly telling you to go and look at that journal because it has a lot of good research articles. And this one, as you can see, was published by Barry McGaugh. In 2008, it was online, but here he explains the background for OECD. And that is also because you, at the time, you were Director of Education at OECD. So you were among those who worked and established this. And I hope we can have some questions also later and discussions around this, because I think if you go back and read the original framework for PISA, you will see that there was a lot of good intentions. So I will say, before we criticize, go and look at what was the original goal and how it was supposed to be used. Most assessments and measurements, and even our own research, we need to have a critical eye on it. I will suggest that there's few instruments in the world which has been so much criticized as PISA's OECD study, and that is good, but we need to do that with everything we are doing, because there's no perfect measurement or assessment. But where did it come from? The story goes back to 1950, actually, and a colleague of mine, Jan-Erik Gustafsson in Sweden, he wrote about this and how United Nations Education, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, and Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, started working on collecting data across the education system worldwide. And that led to another meeting, which is very, very famous. And for those of you who love numbers and are psychometricians, for instance, I know there's a few here now, they will know about this meeting in Hamburg in 1958. And you will recognize names such as Benjamin Bloom, Robert Thorndike, Torstein Hussein, another Scandinavian. They were actually the background for the IEA study. And the next slide, please do not worry. If you're interested, you can have all the slides. The next slide is not for you to read. Just look at the overview. So the first one here shows one international organization who is in charge of a lot of studies, and that's IEA. They are in charge of, for instance, PEARLS and TIMSS, which I will talk about later. Very often they will say, we are more curricula dependent in our tests because we study the curricula before we make the tests. These studies, on the other hand, OECD studies, such as PISA, and PISA is the most well-known, they will say, we are not dependent on curriculum. We can be tested, and this test can be used in any country because we go across the curricula. It's curricula independent. And that is one of the big differences people are discussing. Is that possible or is it not? And then some people will actually say the framework, which came from 1999, and actually it's 25 years ago, said there are some key competences which everyone should know and be able to do at the end of schooling. For instance, solving problems, have approaches to learning, have critical thinking, self-regulation, and the ability to understand how to face challenges you hadn't even thought of, such as getting out of a cave if you're stuck. Someone actually was rescued in Chile. They were stuck for 39 days and they came out after great help from a team. But I was particularly interested in those two approaches here in booklets from PISA in 2009. Learning to learn, the theme learning to learn. All the questions in the questionnaire who's asking students, how are you thinking about learning when you are preparing for a test? And they actually tried to capture whether students were using elaboration strategies or memorization strategies. And for those of you who listened to John Hattie the other day, you will remember that he is always talking about that and talking about the importance for teachers to know when to use the different strategies. Because we don't memorize always, but sometimes it's good to have memorized some factual knowledge so you can use your cognitive load to solve problems. There's always a healthy balance here. And those were the things I was interested in. I was so interested that I ended up doing a whole PhD on just a student questionnaire. And the first article I published on my PhD, together with Andy Moll in Berkeley at the time, that was actually looking at whether the student questionnaire was valid or not. I looked at more than 4,500 students from Norway, and I tried to figure out if they had understood the questions. Unfortunately, I found out that the 20% who performed at the lowest on the PISA test in Norway, they actually didn't understand the questions the way the test developers wanted them to understand it, which is not a surprise. I remember I said it to Ray Adams when I came to the meeting in Melbourne, and he reminded me of one thing. If you want trend data, you can't change the measurement. So we have a challenge, and I would say one of the things which is a challenge on these studies is that we want to improve how we measure. But if we want trend data for over 25 years, we can't change it too much. So that is one of the things we're looking at in the questionnaire expert group also. How much can you change? What do you keep? And what do you delete when something is not good enough? So international tests, they influence learning based upon at least 3 processes. What policymakers, teachers, and researchers count as valuable learning. Why do I say that? Well, I used to be a teacher in the classroom. And I think most teachers know that when the exam is coming up, you try to teach so the students do as best as they can in the test. No matter what we're saying, it's hard not to be affected. If there's high-stake tests in a school, you want your students to succeed. On the other hand, you can turn it around and say, but does that matter? If we want them to read, why don't we teach them proper reading strategies? It's important for them to be able to read for later in life. We'll come back to this point. These tests also influences assessment systems and how they are developed around the world, and I will come back and give evidence for that claim. They also influence how students approach their learning, because when we change the tasks we give in schools, when tests and exams are informed by these studies, it actually have an impact on what we're doing in classroom. And then how students are approaching their learning. Because we know students would like to do well too. So they are trying to find good strategies to do well on tests. In one of the research projects I did, the Norwegian government asked me to evaluate reform in Norway. And as part of that, I interviewed 3 ministers of education in Norway, and I interviewed Andreas Schleicher at the time he was in Oxford. And it was very interesting because Andreas Schleicher has been working in OECD and has been almost the face of PISA now for 15 years or more. And he said he had been to Norway many, many times and discussed national tests and how they should be developed in Norway. 3 times. So when I then asked him about that again, he would say this is how tests should be improved. The point is that the ministers of education, they came up with a different story. They basically said, no, this did not happen the way, and PISA has not that much influence. We discussed this a lot, but it has been used as a critique, because if a country would like to be independent, why should it be dependent on what OECD is doing? And my supervisor again would say, well, he was part of the group who developed a national test in Norway. He basically said, we needed to improve the skills, because in Norway we didn't have quantitative skills at all before PISA. In fact, at the university, there was really hard to get any quant skills workshops, and so we in a way needed to improve our skills in this space. But when PISA came also, why on earth would they change their politics, education politics in Norway? Well, it was very much because we got what was seen as PISA shock. And the PISA shock happened in many, many countries. It also happened in India. I was in India in 2013 and I spoke to some teachers. They were really upset because in India they had the results that they were number 72 out of 73 countries participating in PISA. And no one wants to be at the bottom feeling that they're not good enough. So why did this happen? Well, other countries would blame teachers too. Like in UK, they would constantly compare themselves with whatever happened in China or Shanghai specifically, or Singapore, other countries. And then they would say that this is simply not good enough. While for those who understand this front page, anyone who can understand, you will see the story is different. Yeah. So, stop blaming teachers for falling results and give them the trust and time to actually teach. That is what a lot of people will say in countries, for instance, such as Australia or Scandinavia or in Germany, where people feel that this is actually not fair. And they will say that international studies such as PISA, it's just not good enough because it's just ending up with a game of blaming people. And no one really needs that. Well, you can also see reactions such as what Obama said. But I have to say that was one of the few times it seemed to have any reaction in US. The last time I was in US and PISA came out, it was hardly any reaction there because they basically focused on their own studies. And Michael Gove, he really used PISA and even made in England, and even said that Andreas Schleicher is the most important man in England, and we should thank him. So the shock came in Norway, and again, why I was holding this book from my good friend Pasi Salberg, colleague here, is because we all went out and bought this book, Finnish Lessons, because when we got the shock in Norway that the rankings showed that the Norwegians were not as good as we thought they were, then we also got a shock that the Finns were better than us. And the thing is that there's nothing more important in Norway than being good at going skiing. And when the Norwegian Minister of Education came home from the meeting after the results in 2001 were out about the first PISA cycle, and Finland was like a top, Norway was average, she just said on the press conference, this is like coming home from the Olympics in ski, only with fourth place and no medals. So what happened? Well, this is the slide I wanted to show you. I interviewed all the ministers of education, I interviewed him, we tried to figure out what really happened. And there's a lot of discussions around, can we really trust the rankings? I ended up thinking, are the rankings the key? You will know that basically there's not that much difference on the rankings. There are some countries who are doing extremely good and some are not that good, but there's a lot of countries clustering together. So if you really look at the points, it doesn't really say much whether you're number 14 or 17 sometimes. What we really need to do and need to do together with teachers are to interpret them and to understand them. For the policy, it has had an impact, and here's the evidence when I'm saying it has had an impact on what's happening nationally level. You will see that countries made changes. Most countries which made changes in the assessment systems are those countries which was disappointed, except from one country here. Korea has done well, but they have used it to look at their admission tests and how they get students into universities. But Germany, for instance, some of you might know Professor Eckhard Klima. He put up a whole research program in Germany around how to increase and improve the standards and improve the education research and systems in Germany and have national standards, because just like Norway, they didn't have that before PISA. So there's a lot of politics here, and it's a really challenging landscape to be in. When I was in Oxford, together with one of my DPhil students, or PhD students, as we call them here, we looked at the responses in media in England and Norway. And one thing which was very interesting to find out is that the blaming of teachers were much more strong in England than it was in Norway. And at that time, the things had changed a bit in Norway. So we ended up finding a lot of information about how teachers were actually thanked in Norway for doing a good job, although England on the PISA test did much better than Norway did at the time. That also was interesting to look at some Australian comments recently. I think it was the Grattan Institute who had a report out saying something about students not doing their best in Australia, and they should be proud of that. I will say that when I see things like that, I always think it's a challenge for research when journalists are writing like that, because there's a lot of myths around our research. In fact, PISA has had test motivation scale as part of the test since its beginning. And you can also find studies where you have actually studied it properly. We did study it properly in 2006, 2009, 2012 in Norway. And we actually found out that the Norwegian students, they reported on that scale, on test motivation, that they actually did as good as they can. And when we went back and interviewed some of them, it was very interesting that these 15-year-olds had picked up a lot from what the journalists had been writing in the media at the time. And they said things such as, we know that we're always blamed for being lazy. We know that everyone thinks that we're lazy compared to, for instance, students in China or Singapore. But we want to do the best for the country. And they actually said that in Norway. We don't want to come across as we're stupid. And this is very interesting because this test doesn't have anything to say for their personal life. It's just part of something which is aggregated to country level. But it's a reminder that sometimes we need to actually take a step back and wonder, do we have empirical evidence for our claim? How do we know? It's very easy to blame students and say, oh, they don't care. But how do we know? We can only know if we do empirical research. And that's why I still like that we have PISA. And one of the things which I thought was very interesting was that in 2018, we published a study which is actually one of the most read. And I think that's very interesting because this is a review of 654 peer-reviewed studies of PISA. And what we found out, we wanted to understand, what do researchers use this data for? And can it actually be helpful in any way? Well, look at the numbers. One of the things we found is, again, that Australia, with far less population than US, they are topping the list. It's only US who publishes more on PISA than Australia. So here you will see that there's 72 articles which has been published in Australia in that time. 114 EU and US. For me, that was really interesting, and I think it was a kind of an explanation coming back to why Australia. It was so much going on in Australia, so much coming out of Australia, which is good for schools. But also, what did they publish on, these researchers? Well, they publish a lot of them are using the secondary data sets, which is science, reading, mathematics, data from 15-year-olds, which you can actually now go and download for free. So if you're a student and you wonder about something, go and check what's out there for free first, and then you can think about what kind of research question you want. These data sets should be used way more than they are, because they are out there in the public. There's a lot of critical studies here, and there's a lot of also impact policy studies. So it is a challenge, and you can see very often it's very black or white. You have people who hate these studies, and then you have people who try to say we should use them. Some people are probably uncritical. I think I'm trying here to say there's a possibility of being a critical researcher in the middle. But I also want to acknowledge that one of my friends who passed away, unfortunately, during COVID times in lockdown, but Harvey Goldstein was among those who criticized PISA the most. And I've learned a lot from him. He's a professor in England. And The good thing is that we were able to always collaborate in assessment and education, but he had a very critical eye and perspective on these tests. And one of the things which he said when he also signed this paper, which was published in The Guardian, was that we are not really testing what the school systems are able to do in the different countries. We are testing more what different countries are doing outside of school. And he used the data which show that in certain countries, for instance in Ireland and China, there's a high percentage of students who have tutors outside of school. So he said you can't use PISA data only to say anything about the school system, because in some countries you're actually saying more about the tutoring system. I still think this is important. And one of the things which I think is very important is that we have studies such as PEARLS. And here will you see my very good friend and colleague, Deputy Director Josh McRae, who in 2017 presented the results from PEARLS in England. And he was the lead author and had been leading the analysis of this study. This is a reading study, for those who do not know that. It's also taking place in Australia. You test reading comprehension among children when they're around 11 years old. And he had just presented the results, and here he discusses with Minister of State Nick Gibb how to interpret the results. One of the very interesting findings which he presented was about students' prior attainment. I'm not going to show much of these graphs, but this one is just showing the scale for PEARLS on the left side. And then you can see certain numbers. You will see that Australia is also among the countries. England, of course, here. And you will see the different levels. And then you will see that to understand international tests, you can sometimes match them with data sets from your own country. And that's one of the genius things which Josh did to understand the PEARLS study. And another thing which he found was that there's correlation between prior knowledge. So performance on key stage 1 reading assessment, that actually had a positive association with the results on PEARLS later. At the same time, these students took a phonics test at the time, and those students who did well on the phonics test when they were around 6 years old, they performed better on this PEARLS test. And it created a lot of discussions around the use of phonics. I've seen a similar discussion in Australia. I love the fact that Linda Darling-Hammond said, "Stop reading wars." That's what she said here 10 years ago. And I'm thinking, why can't we not just stop the wars and just collaborate? We need phonics, obviously. The data shows if you match assessment data from a country, if you do well in phonics when you're young, you do better in reading comprehension when you're older. And it matches what we know also from theory. Those who have high vocabulary when they're young, they also do better. So vocabulary is also one of the variables who has an impact. But we need to see the evidence sometimes here. We published this together with Kit Double, another Australian who worked with us in Oxford. And we argued, based upon these data sets, that it's actually important to have a focus also on phonics. But these studies can also inform us about other important matters. What really matters? And we know this. So my supervisor used to say, really, we only need one question in international large-scale studies. The one question is, how many books do you have at home? That's the item which correlates highest with achievement. When we know that, we should do something about it. Yeah? And age matters, and also the socioeconomic status, of course. But how can we do something about it? We need to collaborate with teachers, of course. We had a project in Oxford, and this is where I'm coming to what I really mean matters. We need to have knowledge exchange with those who are working in the classroom, and we need to share the knowledge and understand what is important for us and what is not that important. We looked at Pearls for Teachers, which was a project, an ESRC Impact Acceleration Award, where we used knowledge from Pearls and discussed with teachers from 8 schools in England, what can we use from the data sets, what do you want to know, and how can we improve what is going on in the classroom. We wrote a policy brief for IEA, which they shared with their participating countries in Pearls, and we basically discussed and developed materials for teachers which they wanted to use in their classroom. This kind of practitioner engagement had also been going on in Germany and Norway. And for instance, in Germany, my colleague, which I will acknowledge here, Jenny Lenkert, who was also part of this Pearls for Teacher, they had done a lot of what I call translation work for teachers and how to understand these studies. So they discussed actually what kind of impact can they have in classroom? What can we do? What can we do better? And one of the things is that we actually discussed tasks. We showed tasks from Pearls, and we discussed what is reading comprehension. How do you teach if you want students to learn? What kind of tasks do you show? And why does that matter? Well, you know why it matters, because a lot of you know about test wiseness. You know the difference between using multiple choice tests sometimes and open responses. You know why we need to teach students how to write well, to do well on tests. All these articles I'm just showing, not for you to read abstracts, but just for you to show that there's always some article behind what I'm presenting, and you can go there and find them open access if you want to. I haven't been able to delete this slide as of yet. I have used it before. I think it reminds me of the good times. We were in Berkeley at the time when he was trying to be elected, and it really feels very, very different. I really hope things will go well, but sometimes it's hard. But the reason why I'm showing this is because for my students, when I'm teaching assessment, I show them this example. This is from Pellegrino, and when we're talking about assessment, we need to talk about this here. Okay. And then you have the other one, which is this one. The problem with assessment is how we make the tasks decides not only how students approach their learning, but also what they will learn, how they will learn. But if we have a multiple choice test, these students will actually fail. But if we have a task with an essay, these students will do better. So sometimes it's not about the students, it's about how we make the test. That's what it's all about. That's what we need to discuss in the future. What kind of tests do we want to have, both internationally, nationally, and in the classroom? One bold idea. We can start testing what matters. And I'm saying that, thinking about Marcia McKenzie and her presentation, which she had in Dean's Lecture in 2023. For those of you who have not seen it, I urge you to see it. She's talking about what matters and climate. And then we can think about that this woman, which I showed the picture, the mother of sustainable development, which used to be Prime Minister in Norway, she worked on these matters in 1987. That's a long time ago, and we know what's going on in the world at the time. So there are colleagues in Norway which have actually suggested that we should start focusing on ranking schools and countries in science, mathematics, and reading. Not only that, but start ranking them according to their ability to educate for sustainability. Wouldn't that have been fascinating? Then I will say, well, actually, go back to PISA and science framework. They gave tasks about climate from the start. There are science questions which we can go back and look at. And we can see and track trends, how students fare in these matters, and we can continue to do it. So I wanted also to say that I'm so thankful for being in a team where I came on board and challenged a team in Melbourne to work with me on what matters. And one of the things which then matters is critical thinking. And we have scholars in our research team which immediately were on board and published together with Josh and I. And I'm just showing you this in the end here of this lecture, because this is also part of what is happening now in the space of international large-scale studies. There are things which will be said later, but there's a reason behind why I'm showing you this. So, future directions, what can be said and what cannot be said. We shall continue to work on nurturing curiosity and creativity. We should continue to work on these matters, which Esther has been published, Esther Kerr, and which has been part of PISA and international studies for a long time. And we shall continue to work and think about how we can work together with teachers and how we can integrate student voices and how we can collaborate. This is taken from articles which are reflecting some of the work I have been leading, which I want to lead in the future. But I want to lead it in a way which is for everyone. And we know after COVID, globally, we have lost more girls than we want to, in the sense that they're not in education any longer. And one of the projects which I wish I had done better, which I didn't lead very well, but I wish I had done it better, was a project which I worked together with Josh McRae in Tanzania and South Africa. And that taught me a little bit about being humble, because I had been working on formative assessment for many, many years. And then we went to challenging contexts in Dar es Salaam in South Africa. And we tried to work on formative assessment practices with teachers in the classroom where there were no electricity. And students were sitting on the floor, and we were talking about the peer assessment to them. One teacher, 187 9-year-olds. I think we need to understand how this is going to be done in the future. And I would say we need international large-scale studies, because they can also tell us something important about how countries are faring. And right now, when I said I didn't want to delete the slide with Obama, one of the reasons is that in the international large-scale studies, we're actually tracking what countries are also teaching. And think about this. Countries now are banning books. We should stop talking about which instruction of reading we're using. We should start talking about what are we giving our children to read. We should give them stories of hope, because they will certainly need it. But we should also give them different stories about the history they're part of. And we should challenge this history we are a part of and acknowledge what we haven't done right. And the reason why we need to do this is because education is for democracy. That's what Dewey said. And this is where I have hope. And I want to thank every teacher and head teacher and student who's working together with researchers also to try to make a better future, because we all have talents in different ways, but we can only improve the society, the different context we are in, if we work together. And I know this might be a bit hard in the end, but this is why I'm an educational researcher. So, some might have heard this before, but this is from Teacher and Child, a book for parents and teachers. On the first day of the new school year, all the teachers in one private school received the following note from their principal. Dear teacher, I am a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers and children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses, and women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. So I'm suspicious of education. My request is, help your children become human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human. Thank you.
So it's my honour to offer the vote of thanks for Therese for her wonderful lecture, which has been quite a journey for us, I think, in the room, from thinking about what are the conditions around large-scale assessment and what are the challenges that are inherent in that and the tensions that you face, and Therese for kind of coming clean right off about the complexity that you face as one who's both involved in large-scale assessment but also researching large-scale assessment. And certainly I think there are probably three things that are really important for us to be thinking about tonight. And one is, what is the role of research in large-scale assessment and what's the kind of research that needs to be done? And you've articulated very clearly that it needs to be robust, it needs to be sustained, and it needs to be based on teams, and it needs to be collaborative. And so we see that as really important. I think what we've also heard from the questions and also seen is that what we test really matters, and this issue of context. So in an environment where large-scale testing is not going to go away, where ranking seems part of the work that we're doing, then the work as educators from your work is to be rigorously engaging with it and to be very deliberately looking at who we partner with in that work. So when we're speaking into and speaking back to large-scale assessment, it is through the voices of teachers, it is through thinking about what is actually the purpose of education. And very briefly, that's perhaps the third thing I think that's really been important for me listening tonight, was that your talk and where you finished was, what's actually the purpose of education? What are we assessing? Who are we assessing and how? What's a fair assessment? And how do we work to change systems of assessment from a research base that comes from the Academy in partnership? So could you join me in thanking very much Professor Therese Hopfenbeck.